Ryan Henderson moved through the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles, his mind clouded with unfinished business deals and the pressure of a collapsing timeline. The world around him, a cacophony of traffic horns, street performers, and hurried pedestrians, seemed like a blur. As the CEO of Henderson Developments, he was always planning his next move, negotiating a merger or calculating the rise and fall of market shares. Distraction was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet here he was, lost in his own thoughts. He stepped off the curb, his phone pressed against his ear. "Yes, Roger. I need that report finalized." A blaring car horn cut through the air, jolting Ryan back to reality. His heart leapt into his throat as a sleek, black SUV skidded toward him, tires screaming. The world slowed to a crawl, his phone slipping from his hand, spiraling toward the pavement in what felt like slow motion. And then, a blur of movement. Small, frantic hands shoved him with surprising force. Ryan stumbled backward, crashing onto the sidewalk just as the SUV roared past, missing him by inches. The horrifying squeal of brakes and the gasps of onlookers echoed around him. He blinked, trying to process what had just happened. A young girl lay sprawled on the pavement where he had stood. Her dirty blonde hair fanned out, her small, frail frame twisted awkwardly. A dark stain of blood spread from her knee, soaking the torn fabric of her jeans. Dear God! Ryan scrambled to his feet, panic flooding his system as he knelt beside her. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" The girl opened her eyes, pale blue and brimming with pain but unyielding. She tried to smile, though it wavered. I think I saved you," she whispered, her voice thin and trembling. Ryan's breath hitched. His gaze fell on the harsh reality of the scene. A crowd gathering, curious yet cautious, some whispering, others recording with their phones. The SUV had sped away, leaving only the aftermath. "Someone call an ambulance," Ryan shouted, his voice shaking. A man in a business suit rushed to comply, dialing rapidly. Ryan gently touched the girl's shoulder. "Stay with me, okay? What's your name?" The girl blinked slowly. "Sarah," she murmured. "Sarah Wilkins." Ryan felt an unexpected surge of gratitude and protectiveness. This child, barely more than a child, he realized, had risked her life to save him. He clenched his jaw, trying to control the tremor in his hands. As the sirens approached, Ryan's mind spun with a whirlwind of guilt and disbelief. How had he, a man known for his wealth and power, become so helpless? And how could this little girl have shown such bravery? The paramedics arrived, swarming around Sarah, assessing her injuries. Ryan hovered nearby, his knees soaked with grime from the sidewalk, unable to leave her side. He watched as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her small face contorted with pain, yet her eyes never leaving his. "You're going to be okay," he told her, more to convince himself. Sarah looked at him, her expression softening into something fragile, something that made Ryan's chest constrict. "Will you come with me?" she asked, her voice so quiet that Ryan had to lean in to hear. Ryan swallowed hard, an unfamiliar weight settling on his shoulders. "Yes," he promised, his voice cracking. "I'm not going anywhere." The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as Ryan Henderson paced the stark white waiting room of Los Angeles County General Hospital. Every footstep he took echoed, amplifying the chaos of emotions coursing through him. The world outside these walls, with its relentless energy and ambition, seemed to pause. Here, in this place of vulnerability and fear, time moved differently. Ryan's eyes kept flicking to the double doors that led to the emergency ward, hoping, desperate for any sign of news. His tailored suit, now rumpled and smeared with dirt, felt wrong in this environment. He had made deals worth millions, shaken hands with world leaders, but standing here, waiting for news about a girl he had never met before today, he felt utterly powerless. "Mr. Henderson?" A soft voice broke into his turmoil. He turned to see a nurse, her expression tired but kind. "Sarah Wilkins is stable. We managed to stop the bleeding, and the x-rays didn't show any fractures, just some deep bruising and abrasions. She's asking for you." Relief washed over him, almost leaving him dizzy. "Can I see her?" The nurse nodded, guiding him through the labyrinthine halls of the hospital. Ryan barely noticed the surroundings. The low hum of machinery, the hushed conversations of worried families, the occasional cry of pain. All he could think about was Sarah, the brave little girl who had thrown herself into harm's way for him. When they reached the small, brightly lit room, Ryan hesitated at the threshold. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, looking impossibly small beneath a thin, scratchy blanket. Her leg was bandaged, and a 4-line trailed from her arm. Despite everything, her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Hey," she said, her voice a whisper, but it held a note of joy. Ryan stepped forward, suddenly unsure of what to do with his hands. He settled for sitting on the metal chair beside her bed. "Hey yourself," he replied, his throat thick with emotion. "How are you feeling?" Sarah winced, adjusting her position. "I've been better, but, I'm still here." Her attempt at humor made his chest tighten. Ryan looked down, his hands clasped together. I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "What you did out there it was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Sarah shrugged, but he could see how much it cost her to move even slightly. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just didn't want to see anyone get hurt." The simplicity of her words hit Ryan like a blow. How often had he gone through life thinking of his own ambitions, never considering the sacrifices of others? He didn't even know this girl, yet she had risked everything for him. "Do you have family nearby?" he asked, trying to mask the worry in his voice. Sarah's smile faded, her eyes drifting toward the window. "No," she said softly. "Not really. I live I stay with some other kids. We look out for each other." Her tone was brave, defiant even, but Ryan could hear the loneliness that lingered beneath. Ryan frowned, leaning in slightly. "Other kids," he pressed gently. "What do you mean?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her fingers picking at the edge of the blanket. "We don't have homes," she admitted. Not like most people. We make do." Ryan felt a rush of guilt and disbelief. He had spent millions on luxury apartments, properties that sat empty for half the year. The thought of a child like Sarah, vulnerable and without a home, clawed at his conscience. A silence fell between them, heavy and uncertain. Finally, Sarah broke it, her voice quiet but steady. "I used to have a home. Before my dad went away." She glanced at Ryan, and he could see the pain etched into her young face. "He was a firefighter, the bravest man I knew, but he never came back from this big fire. They never even found him." Ryan inhaled sharply, the pieces of her story clicking together with chilling clarity. A firefighter, disappeared in a fire. The memory of a childhood friend, Jack Miller, surfaced in his mind, unbidden and raw. Jack, who had always been the fearless one, the noble one. And Ryan, the friend who had chosen ambition over integrity. Sarah watched him closely, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice almost pleading. "Can you help me? I need to find him, or at least know what happened." Ryan sat back, the weight of her request settling over him. His pulse thudded in his ears. If her father was who he thought he was, it meant revisiting a past he had tried to forget, a betrayal he had spent years burying beneath success and wealth. He hesitated, not knowing how to respond, how to face the ghosts that Sarah had just summoned. But her eyes, filled with both hope and pain, left no room for avoidance. "I'll try," he promised, though the words felt inadequate. "I'll do everything I can." Sarah's eyes softened, and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her small hand reaching out to grasp his. Her fingers were cold, her grip weak, but the trust she placed in him was palpable. Ryan held her hand, a sense of purpose slowly hardening within him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about profits or deals. He was thinking about a little girl who had saved his life and a debt he couldn't repay with money. As he sat there, the past and present colliding in ways he couldn't ignore, Ryan knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with shadows of old betrayals and the daunting promise of redemption. But for now, he stayed by Sarah's side, the weight of her trust giving him the resolve to face whatever came next. The first light of dawn seeped through the thin blinds in Sarah's hospital room. Ryan hadn't slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the girl lying before him and the broken pieces of her story. Sarah's father, a firefighter who had disappeared in a blaze, had left her a legacy of courage, yet also a life of hardship. As Sarah dozed, her brow creased in discomfort, Ryan felt an unshakable sense of duty forming within him. He'd made a promise, and for the first time in years, a promise he intended to keep, no matter how much it hurt to face the past. Hours later, as the hospital was coming alive with the morning shift, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Ryan was still there, leaning against the wall, lost in thought. Seeing her awake, he pushed off and walked to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Sarah gave him a weary smile. "Better, I think." She glanced down at her bandaged knee, winced a bit, then looked back up at him. "You didn't have to stay." Ryan shrugged. "I figured I owed you at least a night of company after everything." She let out a short laugh, but her eyes softened. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson." Ryan cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "Listen, about what you asked last night, about finding your dad. I don't know how much I'll be able to do, but I'm willing to try." The weight of his own words settled around him. He didn't tell her about his past with her father, about the betrayal that had left their friendship in ruins. That was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Not yet. Sarah's gaze grew intense. "If you find him, tell him I forgive him, okay?" She hesitated, her voice almost breaking. "I don't know why he never came back, but I just need him to know." Ryan's chest tightened at the rawness of her words. "I'll do my best," he replied, hoping it sounded more confident than he felt. He had to find some way to look into the case of her father's disappearance, even if it meant dredging up painful memories. After arranging for the hospital bills and ensuring that Sarah would have a safe place to stay until she healed, Ryan left with a new determination. But as he walked through the bustling city streets, his thoughts drifted back to a different time. A time when he and Jack Miller had been inseparable. Growing up in the narrow streets of their old neighborhood, they had been more than friends. They were like brothers. Jack had always been the righteous one, the kid who'd stand up to bullies, who'd give the shirt off his back to a stranger. Ryan, on the other hand, had been more practical, more willing to bend the rules. Their paths had finally diverged over a decade ago, when Ryan made a ruthless business move that shattered their friendship and led Jack to disappear from his life. But he hadn't known that his actions would lead Jack down such a dark path. With his thoughts in turmoil, Ryan made his way to the fire station where Jack had once worked. It had been years, and many of the faces had changed, but he hoped someone there might remember Jack or be able to direct him to the right records. The station was bustling with activity as firefighters returned from a morning call. He approached the front desk and introduced himself. A middle-aged man with graying hair looked him over, sizing him up. "Ryan Henderson. Can't say I've heard that name around here, but sure, what do you need?" "I'm looking for information on an old friend of mine," Ryan said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Jack Miller. He used to work here, maybe 12 or so years ago." The man's face darkened, a flicker of recognition flashing in his eyes. "Yeah, Jack. Everyone around here remembers Jack Miller." He crossed his arms, giving Ryan a hard look. "Good man. Always put others first. Heard he had some bad luck later on. Disappeared in a big fire about 10 years back." Ryan felt his stomach clench. He had known the facts of the story, but hearing it confirmed this way, knowing it was no longer just a distant memory, made it real in a way he hadn't prepared for. Do you know if there's any chance he survived?" Ryan's voice sounded thin, even to his own ears. The man shook his head. "No one knows for sure. The fire was, brutal. Not much left of the building when it was over. Some folks say he got trapped. Others think he might have made it out and just didn't want to come back." He shrugged. "Guess we all carry ghosts." Ryan clenched his fists, the memories of his own betrayal gnawing at him. If Jack had somehow survived, would he have wanted to come back to a world where his closest friend had sold him out? He thanked the firefighter and stepped outside, the cold morning air hitting him like a slap. He knew what he had to do. Digging up records, talking to old colleagues of Jack's, maybe even reaching out to the families affected by that same fire. As he walked through the streets, his mind raced with questions, regrets, and the weight of guilt that had lain dormant for so many years. He had to confront his own actions, even if that meant discovering that Jack was gone for good. But he owed it to Sarah and to Jack. Ryan sat in his study late into the night, surrounded by the dim glow of his computer and the faint hum of city noise beyond his windows. Piles of old documents, legal files, and records from his business dealings years ago lay sprawled across the table. Somewhere in this mountain of paperwork, he hoped he could uncover something, anything, that would lead him to Jack Miller. He'd always known he'd taken the easy way out when he'd cut Jack off. Back then, he'd told himself it was just business, that Jack would understand. Now he could only wonder how blind he had been, how deep the consequences of that decision ran. Ryan knew that if he was going to uncover Jack's fate, he had to start with what had torn them apart. One document in particular caught his attention, the contract for a development project called Hillside Gardens. It had been one of his earliest and shadiest deals. Back then, it had seemed like a golden opportunity, but Jack had seen right through it. Ryan remembered the heated arguments, Jack accusing him of cutting corners and compromising safety for profit. They had nearly come to blows that last time. Jack had stormed out of his office, saying he'd have nothing to do with a project that endangered lives. But Ryan had moved forward, ignoring Jack's warnings. Hillside Gardens had gone up quickly, touted as affordable housing, a beacon for families starting anew. Ryan's wealth had multiplied, and he had basked in the triumph of his accomplishment. But the joy hadn't lasted. A few months later, an electrical fire had broken out in one of the buildings, spreading rapidly and leaving destruction in its wake. Families had been displaced, lives forever altered, and in the aftermath, his friendship with Jack had been reduced to ashes. It was in that very fire, as he discovered later, that Jack had disappeared. Now, as he sifted through the contract, his hands shaking, he remembered something Jack had said to him that day. "You're going to regret this, Ryan. You can't ignore the cost of your actions forever." The memory hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time, he wondered if Jack's disappearance had been more than just a tragic accident. Could Jack have tried to save the people trapped in that fire? Was he even still alive? Determined to find out, Ryan decided to dig deeper. He spent the next few days retracing every step of the Hillside Gardens project, reaching out to anyone he could remember who had been involved. He called old colleagues, scanned through news archives, and even managed to get a meeting with the fire chief who had overseen the aftermath of the incident. 2 days later, Ryan sat across from Chief Daniels, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense attitude and a piercing gaze. Chief Daniels listened as Ryan introduced himself, his eyes narrowing as he began to recall the details of that fateful fire. "Henderson, you say?" Chief Daniels leaned back, folding his arms. "That was a damn mess, if you ask me. Lost a good man that night. Jack Miller. You two were close, weren't you?" Ryan nodded, the guilt heavy in his throat. "Yes, we were. I'm trying to find out if there's any chance he survived. His daughter needs closure. She still thinks he's out there somewhere." The chief's expression softened, a flicker of sympathy breaking through his gruff demeanor. Jack was one of the best. He went in when others wouldn't have dared. That fire, it was bad. Got out of control in minutes. He sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "We found signs that someone might have made it out, but no bodies to confirm. Just bits and pieces. Truth is, some of the crew believed he might have made it out and gone off-grid. Maybe he didn't want to be found." Ryan absorbed this, feeling a mixture of hope and dread. Why would he do that? Why would he leave his daughter behind? The chief hesitated, studying Ryan carefully. Jack talked about his old life a few times, about regrets, people he couldn't forgive. He looked pointedly at Ryan. Maybe he thought disappearing was the only way to protect her. Ryan flinched, feeling the weight of his mistakes pile onto his shoulders. "If he's alive, I need to find him," he said, his voice a mix of desperation and resolve. "She deserves to know." Chief Daniels considered him for a moment. Then he pulled a small, weathered notebook from his desk drawer, flipping it open to a page marked with Jack's name. There was an address, he said, his voice low. A cabin in the mountains. We found a map with it circled in Jack's locker after the fire, but no one thought much of it at the time. I can't promise anything, but if you're serious about this, it might be worth checking out. Ryan stared at the notebook, the faint hope growing into something more tangible. Thank you, Chief, he said, his voice hoarse. He took the address, an isolated spot a few hours' drive from the city. The next morning, as the sun rose over Los Angeles, Ryan packed a bag and set out, the winding roads leading him further and further from the world he had built. When he finally reached the edge of the mountains, he parked his car and continued on foot. The trail was rough, narrow, surrounded by towering pines and the echo of distant birds. The air grew colder, sharper, as he climbed higher, his legs burning, but he pressed on, fueled by the possibility that Jack might still be alive. As he rounded the final bend, a small cabin came into view, tucked away beneath a dense cover of trees. It was modest, worn, but unmistakably inhabited. There was a faint trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Heart pounding, Ryan approached slowly, his every step crunching on the frost-covered ground. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand raised to knock. What would he even say? How could he explain the years of regret, the pain, the destruction he'd caused? But he owed it to Sarah. He owed it to Jack. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness, and after a long, tense silence, the door creaked open. A man stood there, older, wearier, with lines of hardship etched into his face. But his eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. Ryan's voice caught in his throat as he finally looked into the face of Jack Miller. Ryan stood motionless at the cabin door, face to face with the man he'd thought he'd lost forever. Jack Miller looked every bit the man Ryan remembered, though years of solitude and hardship had left their mark. His once youthful face was weathered, his hair streaked with gray, and his eyes, once filled with unbreakable resolve, held a guarded intensity. For a long, painful moment, neither man spoke. Ryan felt as if the air had thickened, too heavy to breathe. "Ryan Henderson," Jack said at last, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." Ryan swallowed, his mouth dry. He hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't even thought it possible. "Jack, I didn't know if you were alive." Jack's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Is that so? And what brings you here after all these years?" "Guilt." Ryan flinched. He could feel the anger radiating off Jack, the betrayal he'd carried alone in these mountains. But he couldn't turn back now. "I came for your daughter, Jack," he said quietly. "Sarah, she needs you. She saved my life. She thought you were gone forever, but she never stopped hoping." At the mention of Sarah's name, something in Jack's gaze softened, the hardness flickering. "Sarah," he whispered, more to himself than to Ryan. He looked down, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of years had finally caught up with him. Ryan took a hesitant step forward. "She's strong, Jack. She's been surviving on the streets, but she's hurt. She's lost without you. She asked me to find you." Jack turned away, stepping back into the shadows of the cabin. "Come in," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan followed, crossing the threshold into a room filled with sparse furnishings. A small table, a worn-out armchair, a few scattered books, and the bare essentials for living off the grid. The place felt cold, as if it hadn't been warmed by human companionship in years. Jack poured water into a tin cup and handed it to Ryan, who took it with a quiet nod. "So," Jack began, his voice filled with bitterness, "after all this time, you finally care. About Sarah. About what happened." Ryan winced, gripping the cup tightly. "Jack, I made mistakes. I didn't know what the cost would be. I thought about money, success, about everything but the people I was hurting. And you paid the price." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I never meant for it to happen that way." Jack's face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I spent my life trusting you, Ryan. I was there every time you needed someone. When you decided that profit mattered more than people, I was still there, trying to talk sense into you. And that fire, The one that nearly took my life. It was because of that deal. All those families, Ryan. They had nothing. Ryan looked down, guilt flooding him anew. I know, Jack, he murmured. That fire. It burned away more than just buildings. It destroyed everything we built. Our friendship, your trust, and Sarah's life. Jack clenched his jaw, pacing in the small space, clearly wrestling with emotions he'd buried for years. When I got out of that building, I thought about going back, about trying to rebuild. But I was broken, Ryan. I didn't think I had anything left to give her. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady but pleading. But you're here, Jack. You're alive. Sarah has no one else. She risked her life for me without hesitation, and she doesn't even know the truth. Jack stopped, his back to Ryan, shoulders rigid. She doesn't know? He asked, his voice raw. No, Ryan said. She knows you were a firefighter. She knows you disappeared. But she doesn't know about me. About what drove you away. Jack turned slowly, his eyes red-rimmed but resolute. She deserves better than that, Ryan. She deserves better than us. Ryan felt a surge of desperation. Then give her better, Jack. You're her father. She doesn't want anything from me. She wants you. And if you won't do it for yourself, do it for her. She asked me to find you so she could tell you she forgives you. She's a child, Jack, but she's carrying more pain than she should. The words seemed to penetrate, and Jack's eyes softened with a mixture of grief and longing. He sank into the armchair, his face buried in his hands. I've thought about her every day. Every single day, Ryan, he choked out. But what kind of father does this? Leaves his child behind? Ryan walked over, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. A man who made a choice he thought was right, he said softly. It doesn't make it okay. But you have a chance now to make things right. Jack looked up, his eyes meeting Ryan's, filled with a hesitant hope. I don't even know what to say to her. I don't know if I can face her. You don't have to know what to say, Ryan replied. Just be there. She's been through so much, and she's only a kid. You can't change what happened, Jack, but you can still give her a future. The room fell into silence, the weight of unspoken forgiveness hanging between them. Jack took a deep breath, nodding slowly, as if accepting a decision he had already made in his heart. When do we leave? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan felt a wave of relief, mixed with a lingering sadness. We can leave as soon as you're ready. Jack stood, gathering a small, weathered backpack from the corner of the room. He moved slowly, as though waking from a long slumber, and Ryan could see the faint glimmer of hope rekindling in his eyes. They left the cabin in silence, descending the mountain trail together, their footsteps crunching over fallen leaves and frozen earth. Ryan glanced at Jack occasionally, watching the man he had once known as a hero walk beside him, worn but unbroken. In the quiet dawn, Ryan felt the weight of his own burdens lifting, replaced by something he had long forgotten, hope for redemption. As they reached the bottom of the trail and approached the car, Jack turned to Ryan. Thank you, he murmured, a simple, sincere gratitude that made Ryan's throat tighten. Ryan nodded, too moved to speak. As they drove down the winding road back toward the city, he glanced over at Jack, who stared out the window, the lines on his face softening as the city grew closer. They were heading into an uncertain future, but one thing was clear. They were heading toward Sarah, toward a second chance for all of them. The drive back into the city was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. Ryan glanced over at Jack periodically, noting the tension in his friend's shoulders, the nervous way his hands fidgeted with the straps of his worn backpack. Jack was lost in thought, his eyes focused on the passing landscape, though Ryan suspected he was barely seeing it. It was nearly dusk when they pulled into the hospital parking lot. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the building, casting long shadows across the pavement. Ryan parked, took a steadying breath, and turned to Jack. She's in room 312, he said, his voice gentle. She doesn't know we're coming, but she's been asking for you. Jack nodded, his face pale. I still don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Ryan placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Just let her see you. That'll be enough. Jack took a shaky breath, then opened the car door. They walked side by side, passing through the sterile halls of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of medical machines filling the air. Nurses bustled past. Families sat in quiet clusters, faces etched with worry. But to Ryan and Jack, all of it blurred into the background as they made their way towards Sarah's room. As they reached the door, Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Ryan waited, sensing the storm of emotions surging through his friend. I thought I'd lost her," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "All these years, I thought it was better this way. But now," he swallowed hard, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve her forgiveness." Ryan's voice was firm but compassionate. Maybe not. But she wants to see you, Jack. She wants her father back." Jack nodded, wiping his face, and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Sarah lay curled on her side, her bandaged leg propped up on a pillow. She looked fragile, smaller than she had in Ryan's memory, her blonde hair splayed out against the pillow. The sound of the door opening stirred her, and she blinked awake, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. When she saw Jack standing in the doorway, her face froze, confusion and disbelief flickering across her features. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Jack took a tentative step forward, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and pain. "Sarah, it's me. I'm here." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she struggled to sit up, wincing from the effort. She reached out a trembling hand, as if afraid he might vanish if she moved too quickly. Jack crossed the room, sinking to his knees beside her bed, and took her hand in his own. You're really here," Sarah murmured, a tear slipping down her cheek. Jack nodded, his own eyes red-rimmed. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here." She looked at him, searching his face, as though memorizing every line, every wrinkle, every sign of the years that had passed. Why did you go away?" she asked, her voice fragile, filled with the raw pain of a child who'd spent years wondering. Jack's gaze dropped, shame and regret pooling in his eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered. "I thought that you'd be better off without me. I was broken, Sarah. I didn't know how to be the father you needed." Sarah shook her head, gripping his hand tighter. "But I needed you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I waited and waited. I didn't care about anything else. I just wanted you back." Jack let out a shuddering breath, his voice breaking as he replied, "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." She pulled his hand closer, her fingers tracing the rough calluses and scars. "I forgive you, Dad," she whispered, her voice a mixture of strength and vulnerability. "I don't care about the past. You're here now, and that's all I ever wanted." The weight of her forgiveness seemed to shatter something within Jack, and he let out a quiet, anguished sob, clutching her hand as if it were the only thing grounding him to this moment. Ryan watched, his own eyes stinging as he stood in the corner, feeling like an intruder in this intimate reunion, yet knowing he was witnessing something profound. After a long silence, Sarah looked over at Ryan, her gaze softening. "Mr. Henderson, thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Ryan managed a small smile, his throat tight. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. You're the one who saved me. I just kept a promise." Jack looked up at Ryan, gratitude shining in his weary eyes. "You brought her back to me, Ryan," he said, his voice filled with an emotion Ryan hadn't expected, an unspoken forgiveness. "I don't know how to repay you for that." Ryan felt a surge of relief, the tension of years of guilt and regret slowly unraveling. "Then don't," he replied, his voice steady. "Just be there for her. That's all I ever wanted." They sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of the moment settle, the shadows of the past finally giving way to something brighter. Ryan knew there was still a long road ahead, for both Jack and Sarah, but they had each other now. They had the one thing that mattered most, a chance to heal, to rebuild what had been lost. As the nurse peeked in to check on Sarah, Ryan took that as his cue to leave. He glanced back at Jack and Sarah, their hands still clasped, their bond somehow stronger than it had ever been. "I'll be around if you need me," he said quietly, "but I think you two have a lot to catch up on." Jack nodded, giving Ryan a look of understanding and gratitude that needed no words. Ryan took one last look at Sarah, her face now filled with hope instead of sorrow, and turned to leave. As he walked down the quiet hospital corridors, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. The weight of his mistakes wasn't gone, but it felt lighter, less oppressive, as if he had finally started to atone. Outside, the city lights glimmered in the fading twilight, and Ryan took a deep breath, letting the cool air wash over him. There was still work to be done, still ways he could make a difference, and he knew now, with absolute clarity, that he wouldn't be doing it alone. Days passed, each one seeming to carry a quiet, fragile piece as Jack and Sarah began to rebuild their connection, piece by piece. Ryan visited them in the hospital often, always finding them a little closer, a little more whole than before. Sarah had been discharged from the hospital, but she was still recovering, and Ryan offered to let them stay in one of his properties while she regained her strength. Jack hesitated, wary of accepting any more help from the man who had once been his closest friend and greatest disappointment. But for Sarah's sake, he relented. The apartment Ryan chose for them was small but warm, nestled on the quiet outskirts of the city, away from the noise and distraction of downtown. It overlooked a park, and from the wide windows, Sarah could see families walking hand in hand, children laughing as they chased each other through the grass. She spent hours by that window, sometimes lost in thought, sometimes talking quietly with her father. One late afternoon, as the sun cast a soft glow over the city, Ryan knocked on their door. Jack opened it, his face still holding a trace of suspicion, though it was tempered now with a reluctant gratitude. "Ryan," Jack said, stepping aside to let him in. "Didn't expect to see you today." Ryan smiled faintly. "I thought I'd check in, see how you two were doing." "I know it's a big adjustment," Jack nodded, glancing over at Sarah, who was perched by the window, watching the sunset. "Yeah," he murmured. It's going to take time. But she's strong." Ryan followed his gaze, his own heart softening as he watched Sarah's small, steady figure outlined against the window. "She's more than strong. She's a fighter. She saved my life, you know." Jack gave a small, sad smile. "That sounds like her." He paused, rubbing a hand over his face, his voice growing softer. "You've done a lot for her, Ryan. More than I ever expected. I never thought you'd." Ryan held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "Jack, I didn't do any of this to make up for what happened. I did it because she needed help, and because I wanted to do the right thing. For once." Jack studied him, the tension in his face softening, the years of anger and bitterness giving way to a tentative understanding. "Then I guess maybe we both have a chance to start over." Ryan nodded, feeling a weight lift. "Maybe we do." They sat together, the silence between them no longer strained but comfortable, filled with the knowledge that some things could be forgiven, even if they couldn't be forgotten. After a while, Sarah came over, her face lighting up when she saw Ryan. "Hey, Mr. Henderson," she greeted him with a shy smile. "I didn't know you were coming." Ryan chuckled. "Thought I'd surprise you." "How are you feeling, Sarah?" "Better," she replied, glancing at her father, a spark of happiness in her eyes. "A lot better now." They talked for a while, laughing quietly over small stories, reminiscing about moments they barely knew they'd shared. Ryan felt a strange but welcome feeling, as if they were becoming something of a family, a patchwork one built from broken pieces, yet stronger because of it. After a while, Sarah grew thoughtful, her eyes shifting between the two men. "You know," she said quietly, "I don't know much about what happened between you two. But whatever it was, I think it's okay now." Her words were simple, but there was a quiet wisdom behind them that made both men look away, each absorbing the depth of her forgiveness in his own way. When Ryan finally left, he felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that extended beyond his empty penthouses and office towers. It was as if, in helping Jack and Sarah, he had somehow healed a part of himself he hadn't even known was wounded. As he walked down the empty hallway of the building, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, a reminder about a board meeting scheduled for the following morning. A time would have been when Ryan would have dropped everything to prepare. But tonight, he simply sent a quick reply, acknowledging the meeting but deciding it could wait. For once, he wasn't in a rush. There were other things, more important things, that needed his attention. The next day, Ryan woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He arrived at his office early, glancing around at the gleaming surfaces and pristine decor with fresh eyes. The world he'd once held in such high regard felt somehow empty, as if stripped of the importance it had once carried. When his board meeting began, Ryan listened to the usual reports, the quarterly projections, the discussions of profit margins and market shares. But his mind drifted back to Sarah and Jack, to the way they had clung to each other, the way their lives had been bound together by forgiveness and second chances. Midway through the meeting, he cleared his throat. "I'd like to discuss a new initiative," he announced, surprising the room. "Something that will make a difference beyond our usual goals." The board members exchanged glances, confused. "What do you have in mind?" one of them asked. Ryan took a deep breath. "I want to set aside a significant portion of our profits to create a foundation for families in need, especially for children who don't have homes or support. We'll use our resources to help them build better lives. There are too many kids out there who don't have anyone looking out for them. I think it's time we change that." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. This wasn't the kind of proposal they'd expected from Ryan Henderson, the man who had built his empire with an unwavering focus on profit. One board member spoke up cautiously. "But Ryan, this will impact our bottom line. Our shareholders might not approve." Ryan met their skeptical gazes, his voice steady. "Then let's find shareholders who will. This company can afford to make a difference, and I intend to see it happen." There was silence as the board members digested his words, each of them slowly coming to terms with the new direction Ryan was proposing. But Ryan didn't need their approval. He felt certain for the first time in years, guided by a conviction that went beyond profit or reputation. He was finally building something that mattered. As he walked out of the boardroom, a sense of peace filled him. The ghosts of his past would always be with him, but he knew now that he could live with them, could even use them as a reminder of the man he wanted to be. And as he stepped out into the bright Los Angeles sunshine, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that, at last, he was on the right path. The car ride back from the shelter was quiet, yet the silence held a kind of peace that hadn't existed before. Jack sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline, the familiar weight of regret feeling lighter with each passing mile. In the back seat, Sarah leaned her head against the window, lost in thought, a faint smile playing on her lips as she recalled the children she had met that evening. For the first time in years, Jack felt that he was beginning to atone for his absence, his failures, and his silence. But he also knew he couldn't have reached this point alone. When they arrived at the apartment, Sarah went to her room, leaving the two men alone. Jack lingered in the living room, glancing at Ryan. "You know," he began, his voice rough from a night of raw emotion, "when I left the city, I thought I'd never look back. I wanted to bury all of it. My past, our friendship, the failures. But I guess life has a way of pulling you back to the things you thought you could leave behind." Ryan met his gaze, nodding. "I understand. I thought I could bury it too. But seeing Sarah, seeing the hope she has even after everything, she reminded me that I can still make a difference, that it's not too late to make things right." Jack looked away, emotions flashing across his face. "You're lucky, Ryan. You still had the chance to make things right without losing everything. Some of us didn't get that choice. But I suppose maybe we're both finding it now." Ryan sensed the shift, a fragile truce forming between them that might grow stronger in time. "We're not the men we were, Jack," he said quietly. "And maybe that's the point. Maybe we had to lose who we were to find what really mattered." Jack didn't respond right away, but there was an understanding in his eyes, a recognition that Ryan's words resonated deeply. They both had scars from betrayal, from guilt, from decisions that had shattered lives. Yet here they were, standing on the brink of a new beginning, shaped by those very scars. A week later, Ryan invited Jack to meet with him at the headquarters of Henderson Developments. Jack hadn't set foot in an office building in years, much less one as impressive as the towering glass skyscraper that bore Ryan's name in bold letters. Stepping into the lobby felt surreal, a collision of his past and present as he walked past walls of polished marble and glass. But he was here on a new mission now, one that meant more to him than any success he'd once imagined. Ryan greeted him at the front and led him through a hallway adorned with sleek, modern art. They passed rows of cubicles and bustling staff members, all carrying stacks of documents, moving with the focused energy of people chasing deadlines. They were heading to a large conference room where several team members of the newly formed Second Chances Foundation waited, ready to discuss expansion plans and ideas for reaching more families. Jack took a seat, feeling the weight of all he had been through, and yet he was present, engaged, ready to contribute. He scanned the faces of the team members, all professionals with clean-cut appearances and focused expressions. They looked at Jack with curiosity, not recognizing him as the man Ryan had once nearly destroyed in his quest for success. To them, he was someone new, someone with a vision they were eager to hear. Ryan introduced him formally, his tone full of respect. "This is Jack Miller. He's the reason we're doing this. His experiences have shaped the way we're approaching this foundation, and I'd like you all to listen closely. He knows this work better than anyone here. He's lived it." The words hit Jack with an unexpected force. Ryan was giving him a place of honor, a recognition that Jack never thought he'd receive from him again. He cleared his throat, nodding in thanks, though he was nearly overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. "Thank you, Ryan," Jack said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "I won't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know what it's like to be on the other side. I've met people who needed help and had nowhere to turn. They're not just numbers or projects. They're kids like Sarah, people who fell through the cracks and have no one looking out for them. That's what this foundation needs to be for. Finding those people, giving them a hand when they've been pushed down." The room was silent, each team member listening intently. Jack spoke about his own experiences, the faces he remembered from his years working with people in desperate situations, and the stories that had stayed with him long after he'd left the city. He talked about what it felt like to be a firefighter and the helplessness of watching lives unravel because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. One of the team members, a young woman named Mia, raised her hand, her face thoughtful. "Mr. Miller, what do you think is the most urgent need for the people we're trying to reach? Is it housing, education, or something else?" Jack considered the question, leaning forward. "Honestly, it's all of those things. But if there's one thing that makes the biggest difference, it's stability. Kids can't think about school if they don't know where they're sleeping that night. Parents can't hold down a job if they're worried about putting food on the table. Stability is the foundation that everything else depends on. Without that, nothing else sticks." Mia nodded, scribbling notes, and Ryan watched Jack with a growing respect, realizing how much wisdom his old friend carried, how deeply Jack understood the reality behind the statistics and spreadsheets. After the meeting, as the team filed out, Ryan and Jack lingered in the empty conference room, the city skyline stretching before them through the vast windows. "Thank you for coming, Jack," Ryan said quietly, his expression sincere. "Your voice, it means something here. It's helping us see things that we couldn't see before." Jack nodded, his voice softer now. "Maybe this is what I needed too," he admitted. "To be part of something again, something real. I didn't think I'd ever find that." Ryan offered him a small smile. "Well, then maybe we both found what we were missing." Over the next few months, Jack and Ryan worked side by side, each contributing their strengths to the foundation. Jack helped design programs, met with families, spoke with social workers, and reached out to local communities to bring in volunteers. Ryan used his influence, securing funding, partnerships, and resources, channeling his once ambitious drive into something that made a tangible difference. Together, they saw the foundation grow from a small initiative into a network that reached across the city, touching lives, offering second chances to those who'd thought they'd run out of options. One evening, as they were leaving the foundation's office after a long day, Jack glanced at Ryan, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Ryan, if you'd told me a year ago that we'd be standing here, I'd have called you a liar. Ryan chuckled, nodding in agreement. I probably would have called myself a liar, but I think maybe we were both waiting for a second chance. We just didn't know it. Jack sighed, a peaceful smile on his face. I think you're right. And maybe this is our chance to get it right. Ryan extended his hand, and Jack took it, their handshake carrying the weight of forgiveness, understanding, and a future rebuilt from the ashes of their past. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the lights of the city shining down upon them, they knew they'd found their purpose. And for the first time, both men felt that they were exactly where they were meant to be, not as a real estate mogul or a forgotten hero, but as two friends dedicated to helping others find the hope they'd lost. Months turned into a year, and the Second Chances Foundation continued to grow, spreading across Los Angeles and beyond. With each new shelter opening, each family reached, and each life transformed, Ryan and Jack felt the powerful impact of their work. They had learned that healing was a journey, one that didn't come with quick fixes or easy answers but required patience, consistency, and dedication. One warm autumn afternoon, as the foundation prepared to open its fifth shelter in a small neighborhood just outside downtown, Ryan stood in the courtyard of the new building, watching volunteers finish the final touches. There were flowers planted along the entrance, bright murals painted by local artists, and cozy furniture carefully arranged in the common areas. This shelter, like the others, was designed to feel like home. As he observed, Ryan felt a surge of pride. Not the kind he'd felt years ago after closing big deals, but something richer, deeper. He thought back to his first visit to a shelter with Jack, remembering the faces of the children they'd met, the hopeful look in Sarah's eyes, and the gratitude he'd seen in Jack's. The sound of familiar voices drew his attention. Jack and Sarah had arrived, joining the small crowd gathering for the opening ceremony. Ryan waved to them, watching as Sarah beamed, her eyes taking in every detail of the new shelter. She had become a quiet symbol of resilience within the foundation, inspiring both the staff and the children they served. Her presence here today, at the place that would be a refuge for others like her, felt like the completion of a circle. "Hey, Mr. Henderson." Sarah greeted him cheerfully as she walked over, her father close behind. Ryan grinned. "Hey, Sarah, what do you think? Did we get it right?" Sarah looked around, her gaze thoughtful. "It's perfect," she said, nodding with approval. "I wish I'd had a place like this when I was out there, but I'm glad other kids will have it now." Jack joined them, his expression one of quiet pride. "You've built something real here, Ryan. This is more than I ever thought possible." Ryan looked between Jack and Sarah, a familiar sense of gratitude filling him. "It wasn't just me. We did this together. And we're not done yet." The ceremony began with a few words from the local council members and foundation directors, who shared the story of how Second Chances had grown from a simple idea to a vital part of the community. Ryan felt a mix of emotions as he listened, but it was Jack's speech that struck him the most. Jack stepped forward to address the small crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen people lose everything," he began, looking out at the faces of the families and children who had gathered. "And I've been someone who lost a lot myself. I thought my mistakes had cost me everything, that there was no way back. But thanks to this foundation, I found a way to rebuild. I found a way to help others who feel lost. And I hope this shelter gives every person who walks through those doors the chance to start over, no matter where they come from or what they've been through." The crowd applauded, and Jack stepped back, glancing over at Ryan. There was an understanding between them, a mutual respect that needed no words. After the ceremony, the new residents began to settle in, exploring the cozy bedrooms, playing in the courtyard, and talking with the staff. Sarah moved easily through the crowd, greeting children and encouraging them to join her at one of the tables where she'd set up a small art station. She'd started volunteering regularly at the foundation, running activities and helping with programs for the kids. Her energy and kindness seemed to draw them in, and Ryan couldn't help but watch her, filled with pride for the young woman she was becoming. As the evening drew on, Ryan and Jack found themselves sitting on a bench in the courtyard, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. The golden light cast long shadows across the courtyard, painting the shelter in warm hues. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. For everything you've done. For helping Sarah find me. For giving me this second chance. Ryan looked at him, his expression sincere. You don't have to thank me, Jack. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You pulled me out of a life I thought I wanted but didn't need. You reminded me what mattered. Jack nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Funny, isn't it? How we both had to lose everything to find something real. They sat in companionable silence, watching as Sarah helped one of the younger children with a painting. Her laughter rang out, bright and carefree, a sound that seemed to fill the courtyard with hope. You know, Ryan said after a moment, his voice thoughtful, I never thought I'd be here. I used to think success meant having everything, money, power, influence. But now I understand that it's about this. About being able to help people find a place where they belong. Jack watched him, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. You've come a long way, Ryan. I think the man I knew all those years ago would be proud of who you are now. Ryan met Jack's gaze, and for a moment, he felt the weight of his past lift completely, as if he'd finally found the redemption he had been searching for. The darkness that had once shadowed their friendship had given way to something new, something stronger and more resilient. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Sarah joined them on the bench, her face flushed from excitement. Did you see the kids? She asked, her voice filled with joy. They're already making friends, exploring everything. It's like they've finally found a home. Ryan smiled, nodding. That's exactly what we wanted. The three of them sat together, watching as the shelter's lights illuminated the night, casting a warm glow that could be seen from the street. They knew that within these walls, countless lives would find hope, healing, and the chance to rebuild. And they knew that they, too, had found something precious, something that would carry them forward, together. When it was finally time to leave, Jack placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. For everything. Ryan placed his hand over Jack's, giving it a firm squeeze. No, Jack. Thank you. They turned to look back at the shelter one last time, each of them feeling a sense of peace and purpose that went beyond anything they had ever imagined. The future stretched before them, full of promise, full of second chances, and they walked away, knowing that they had not only changed the lives of others, but had transformed their own in the process. Months passed, and the Second Chances Foundation continued to grow, its impact reaching families and children all over the city. Word of its success spread, drawing support and volunteers from all walks of life, each person inspired by the Foundation's mission of redemption and rebuilding. What had once been an unlikely dream had become a symbol of hope for thousands, and each new shelter, each outreach program, and each smiling face only strengthened Ryan and Jack's resolve. Ryan sat in his office, reviewing the latest report. The foundation had expanded beyond what he'd initially imagined, adding partnerships with schools, training programs for parents, and mental health services for children and young adults. The numbers and figures laid out before him, once just a measure of business success, now represented lives that had found safety and stability. Yet there was one thing missing. A soft knock at his door broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see Sarah standing there, her expression warm but curious. Am I interrupting? She asked, stepping inside. Not at all, Sarah, Ryan said, smiling as he waved her in. Actually, I was just about to make an important call. He lifted the phone receiver, hesitated for a moment, and dialed Jack's number. It didn't take long for Jack to answer. Ryan? He asked, his tone slightly puzzled. Jack, there's something I'd like to talk to you about. Are you free to come by the office? I think Sarah's going to want to hear this too. Within the hour, Jack arrived, looking slightly anxious but curious. Ryan led them both to the conference room, a large, sunlit space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city below. It was a room that had once symbolized power and influence for Ryan, but today it was the place where he would finalize the most meaningful decision of his life. He took a seat, gesturing for Jack and Sarah to join him. I called you both here because I wanted you to know where we're headed next. Jack and Sarah exchanged glances, both intrigued but uncertain. Ryan took a deep breath, his eyes shining with quiet determination. Second Chances was just the beginning. We've seen what it can do, how much it means to people who feel invisible, forgotten. But it's grown to a point where it needs new leadership, people who understand this work from the inside out. He looked directly at Jack. I want you to lead the foundation, Jack. I can't think of anyone better suited for the job. Jack blinked, taken aback. Ryan, are you sure? I mean, this has been your vision from the start. Ryan shook his head, his smile filled with warmth. It's our vision now. And the truth is, you understand these people, these children, better than I ever could. You've lived their struggles, walked in their shoes. I've built businesses, Jack, but what we have here isn't just a business. It's a lifeline, and I know that with you at the helm, it'll reach even further. For a moment, Jack was silent, processing the weight of Ryan's offer. He'd come so far from the days of bitterness and resentment, yet the enormity of leading the foundation was overwhelming. Still, he saw the faith in Ryan's eyes, a belief in him that gave him strength. Jack finally nodded, a small, humble smile on his face. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady. But only if you promise to stay by my side, Ryan. We started this together, and I want to see it through with you. Ryan's smile widened, and he extended his hand. You have my word. They shook hands, and as Sarah watched, a sense of pride and contentment filled her. These two men, both flawed, both marked by past mistakes, had found a way to rebuild their lives and turn their pain into purpose. And now, they were doing it for others. Over the following months, Jack took on his new role with unwavering dedication, working tirelessly to expand Second Chance's reach and ensure its programs met the real needs of the people it served. Sarah remained deeply involved, her compassion and experience inspiring both staff and residents alike. She had blossomed into a young leader, her presence bringing comfort to children who had known only hardship. One crisp morning, as Jack and Ryan walked together through the latest shelter, Jack paused, looking around at the walls adorned with children's art, at the laughter and chatter filling the rooms, and at the volunteers who gave their time so selflessly. We've come a long way, haven't we? He murmured. Ryan nodded, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. Further than I ever imagined. And I wouldn't change a thing. As they continued their tour, Sarah approached them with a small group of children who had just arrived at the shelter. She introduced each one to Jack and Ryan, her smile warm and welcoming, her words encouraging. Watching her, Ryan felt a surge of pride and gratitude for the journey they'd taken, for the second chance they had given each other, and for the lives they had touched along the way. That evening, the three of them sat together on a park bench outside the shelter, watching as the city lights flickered on, one by one. The air was filled with a quiet peace, the kind that comes only after a long, hard journey. They didn't need words to capture the meaning of this moment. They each felt it deeply, a shared sense of fulfillment and purpose that had once been unimaginable. Sarah looked at them both, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. For everything. Jack placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. No, Sarah, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you. You're the reason we're all here. You're the reason we found our way back. Ryan looked at them both, his heart full. We wouldn't have made it without you, Sarah. You saved us both in more ways than you'll ever know. As they sat together, watching the world go by, each of them knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the strength, resilience, and hope they had built together. They had found redemption, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And so, under the quiet Los Angeles sky, they stayed, bound by the unbreakable ties of forgiveness, love, and the knowledge that they had turned their pain into something beautiful, a light for others to follow.